Hi, Tom. Great to see you. I mean, obviously, we would be at NAB this week discussing these things in person at the Dolby booth with some, obviously, some ability to see some of the HDR content in Dolby Vision, as well as hear some of the great work you guys do on the surround sound front. But we aren't, so that's why we're here virtually. Um, where would you like to start as far as, what your messaging would have been at the show this year? And then let's get into a conversation about what's going on in the marketplace and what you're seeing.
Sure, Ken. Good to see you as well. I hope all's good. Yeah, we would have been at NAB, and you know, we had spent a lot of time preparing for what we wanted to message and show folks at the show. Clearly, while we continue to have made a lot of progress in more traditional post-produced content, we were really coming into NAB with a real positive set of momentum. We felt both around Dolby Atmos and Dolby Vision for live productions and live sports in particular. So we were really excited with momentum we had coming into the spring in that area, and so that was going to be a big push for us, including things like the Kraz truck back out in front of the South Hall. We'd seen a lot of work with Dolby Atmos with folks like ESPN, and so that was real exciting. And the Olympics were getting ready. And relative to HDR, we had been doing a lot of work, not just with pure HDR productions, but we had also spent much of 2019 looking at ways to leverage the great work that's being done still in SDR productions, particularly a lot of the 1080p 60 productions and some 4K productions. And we were prepared to show a bunch of that work to more partners and hope to move that ball forward as the industry transitions from standard dynamic range to high dynamic range productions.
Sure. So obviously, the Super Bowl looked great as far as that HDR, SDR workflow, but there's challenges in terms of both ways, right? Going from SDR, producing in SDR and then having tone mapping to HDR, or starting in HDR and then having it, I guess, tone mapping down to SDR. So what do you see as the current challenge? I mean, the good news is there isn't a lot of sports production going on now, but that does give people a chance to kind of maybe sort through their workflows and kind of take the time to understand these things a little better. What do you see as a challenge right now as far as the SDR, HDR world?
I think it's probably the biggest challenge is scale and timing. I think, Fox is an example. I think, the Super Bowl looked great. And they had spent a lot of 2019 really working out the logistics of how to do an HDR production, and some cameras are SDR, more were becoming HDR, how to reliably map that back down to SDR for the bulk of distribution today that's still SDR. And so I think that was really going well, and I think we see a lot of the industry following suit. I think the bigger challenge is there's a lot of productions, right? There's a lot of events, there's a lot of cameras, and if you think about even HD, right? I mean, HD took the better part of 10 years to really kind of go from some of those early broadcasts in 2001, all the way into the tens, if you will.
Right.
That's the right way of saying it.
Yeah.
And it was transitioning, and back Fox is an example, right? They had this whole transition stage, for those of us who still remember things like Fox widescreen, right? They did 480p for the first Super Bowl, and then for a number of years it was still 2002, 2003, wasn't until 2004 that you begin to have all the NFL in HD. And so it takes time. And so if we think about the US sports market today, it's interesting when you think about, particularly when you look at the regional sports nets, right? You have a ton of really high value content, but you have broadcasters, right, or the regional sports nets, who have a lot of things that they have on their plates, right? They're very tightly run fiscal operations, right? They can't do a wholesale upgrade. And so you get the situation where you may have, say, an NBA team that, if it's the ESPN game of the week, maybe a 4K truck rolls in there for that game of the week, but then there's, 100 games the rest of the season that may or may not have the same production quality, and it'll take time for that to trickle all the way. But this is high value content. And
right.
So we've been trying to see, are there ways to maintain that high quality SDR production, but think about the viewer, because the other thing that's happened, probably even faster than the HD transition, is that more and more consumers have HDR capable or HDR displays, in their living room.
Sure.
Depending on how you count the numbers today, there's this classification of HDR and HDR compatible with this arbitrary kind of 500 nit ratio. But if you look at HDR devices, which can support an HDR input, right? Have an HDR panel, have some brightness, say above 250 nits. It's basically, 90% of all 4K TVs being shipped today are HDR compatible by that definition. And so
Right.
you have all these viewers with HDR sets and a bit of an expectation. And we have all these SDR productions, and we will for some time. And I think one of the things that we've been thinking about at Dolby, from the very beginning with a system like Dolby Vision, it's about delivering the creative intent, right? As the content is created all the way to the home. And what you have is you have a lot of content today that's being shot in SDR, but it's being delivered to an HDR display that's doing something to that image. At a minimum, it's stretching the luminance, and
Right.
as you raise that peak brightness, you get color shifts. And so, what the broadcast engineers are seeing in the truck for a look is not always what's going to happen in the living room.
Right. Right.
And so we've been trying to figure out how can we help with that situation, particularly as we look at the longevity of SDR productions through this transition.
Sure. So then do you have since you've been looking at that, what are your proposed solutions? Do you have a proposed solution right now for this?
Well, Dolby always has a solution, right?
Right.
Well, what I would say is, what we've been looking at is, is there a way to kind of capture the richness and the beauty of that SDR look and production, and carry that all the way down the delivery chain to this growing number of HDR displays and set-top boxes in the living room. One of the things that we forget about when we think about how stuff is delivered today is that, particularly with AVC or MPEG-2, you've got an 8-bit codec and delivery system, but you've got a really rich 10-bit production. And actually, within the truck, you've got this really rich, high-quality 10-bit production. You've got full 709 color representation. In fact, many times the cameras are actually capturing a bit more than that color space, and we're using limiters to kind of limit that as it goes down the production chain and then for distribution. And so we've been experimenting with a number of broadcasters about what if we take that full, beautiful 709 production in 10-bit, and if we're able to put that into a 2020 HDR container, if you will, map that into HDR, you're now able to preserve all of its goodness because it's being carried in a larger pipe, if you will, all the way into the living room.
Right.
And so you're not decimating from 10-bit to 8, from 10 to 8 bits. You're capturing all that Rec 709, and you're preserving it all the way to the living room. If you think about an MVPD who's delivering this to their HDR 4K set-top boxes, it's going through an HEVC encoding chain, a 4K encoding chain usually, so even a higher bit rate, so you get less compression issues.
Right.
And so you're kind of preserving all that. And then where Dolby specifically can add value on top of that even further is by creating the Dolby Vision metadata at the MVPD on top of that signal. We're ensuring that the Dolby Vision set-top boxes and TVs in particular can even go one step further in mapping that tone curve properly to the TV.
Right.
And so what you do is you really get these beautiful colors, and particularly think about live sports, right? Where, you get, the oranges or the yellows or the uniforms aren't always going to be preserved all the way through. I mean, beyond just the speculars, which, we talked about, the Super Bowl was a great example of that this year. The speculars were great, but just the color reproduction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that is there in SDR, but it's just kind of lost as it goes all the way through the delivery chain. So we've been working with broadcasters on kind of do's and don'ts, understanding the right way of doing the mapping and some of the challenges if you don't, and putting together kind of best practices to kind of help people think about how they could deploy this in their workflows.
Sure. So I guess the first question that they all have is, HDR or SDR, right? So it goes
Yeah.
back to the HD world of, there's only 2% of the homes or 1% of the homes who can get it, and they don't know how to turn it on properly, and they can't get it through the local TV station. So that's why it's not delivered over the cable system. But it's getting there, right? The Olympics was going to be a huge watershed moment for HDR, I think.
Yep.
Unfortunately, it's going to go till next year, which we can look forward to that. So as far as that question of SDR or HDR, do you have I mean, if you had to take one path, because cost isn't, I mean, the workflow is a little trickier, obviously, for HDR, but the cameras are capable and things like that. So, do you have a recommendation? Is it too compromised? Is SDR and then up mapping to HDR too much of a compromise, you think?
Yeah, I don't think it's a compromise in the sense, we don't think it's a compromise in the sense that over time, we believe the industry will transition to HDR, all in, because there's lots of benefits. But you're going to have a period of time measured in years where you're going to have these SDR productions. And
Right.
so, if you have these SDR productions and you have delivery chains, I mean, take Sportsnets for example, right? Most of that Sportsnet content is going to go direct over a cable or satellite or telecom infrastructure like an MVPD. So we're not talking about ATSC kind of constraints or anything else. And so you still have the full SDR production, and you would still deliver that as is on your mezzanine, but for a relatively low effort and low cost approach. One of the practices we've looked at is what Movie Lab suggests, which is kind of a linear mapping of SDR into HDR, right? So this is, you map from 100 nits to 200 nits. So there's none of this adaptive kind of manipulation of the picture. It's kind of a straight linear transform. It's relatively straightforward. So we're talking about, boxes like the FSHD, so you're not changing any of your production. You're adding a relatively low cost, simple device at the end of it to create a second version that you could send to an MVPD who wanted it. So if you look at, like a Comcast or others who are rolling out a lot of UHD and HDR capable set-top boxes, this would allow them to offer for more and more key events the ability to have this kind of preserved, great viewing experience to more of their, quite frankly, high ARPU users who are buying those boxes. And I think, unlike the HD TV transition, we see a much more significant penetration of TVs in the houses that account for this, right? I mean, 4K TV sets are accounting for significant double-digit kind of penetration now, and most of those now are HDR compatible as well.
Right, right, right. So do you feel that and I know that when I talked with some of the folks who've done some of these shows, it is complicated. It does get a little tricky. It does, Fox did a lot of testing, like you said. So what do you think the industry should be doing, collaboratively, to kind of get more information sharing out there, more shared knowledge? Are you comfortable with where it's at right now, or is there more work that has to be done on that front?
I think there's probably some more testing on this particular topic of capturing SDR, within an HDR pipe for delivery to some viewers. I think, when you peel back, and same at your events, right? When you get, CBS and ESPN and Fox and NBC all on the stage, right? All those teams are all talking to each other. They're sharing insights. They're sharing best practices. They're talking to each other. It's a very collaborative industry. So I think, I think in the kind of true native HDR production and delivery, a lot of that work has happened, continues to happen, and I think that information sharing is great. We think with this idea of, is there a place for SDR productions being delivered a bit differently to a set of users who have an HDR viewing environment within their MVPD environment? I think there's still more research that needs to be done. We've done some with a number of broadcasters, but I think there's an opportunity for more information sharing, more experimentation, right? We've done a lot of stuff with what I'll call controlled lighting live events. So we've done a lot of arena and indoor stuff. We haven't done an enormous amount of outdoor sports. This would be the time we start looking at things like football and baseball, right? So that's going to be delayed a bit. But one of the things that we want to do, and again, this is more industry, although we think Dolby Vision metadata adds value, that's at kind of the very end of the chain, just like HDR productions, right? So our interest is just about helping the production world at all, overall. So we're preparing to kind of share the research that we've done. We're putting together kind of a technical webinar for early May, kind of in lieu of what we had planned on doing at NAB, to begin kind of having the conversation. And I think that'll be the first step. Even with this, COVID situation, I think there's two opportunities. One, people will have a little bit more time when they think about the stuff that they have in the archive. Especially we have a lot of rebroadcasts and a lot of reuse. And so, we can do some experimentation with what's kind of already, on the servers or on the shelf. And then, this transition will be measured in years anyways. And I think this will also have impact on maybe slowing that down a little bit, adoption of full HDR. And so this is an example of how can we extract more goodness or greatness out of what we're already doing, and probably will be doing a bit more given the current situation. But people are going to keep buying new TVs and more set-top boxes. And so how do you kind of balance that transition? It's not meant to replace HDR or delay HDR, but it's how do you fill that middle time?
Right. Well, I guess the good news is that there's no holy war, if you will. I mean, there's in terms of the general enthusiasm for HDR, let's call it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we're not stuck in this thing of, I know there's some format issues and what have you, but it's not like the classic going back to Fox with a widescreen and 480 versus 720 and 720 versus 1080 and all these kind of things. So it's nice to see the enthusiasm for it, right? I think as a format, everyone
Yeah.
gets it, Do you got now? No, this doesn't really relate to Dolby Vision, but as far as the whole UHD 4K versus 1080, because it seems like in the sports side, especially for live, the 1080p HDR seems to be the sweet spot. What's your
Yeah.
sense on that? Are you guys okay with that? I mean, obviously the cameras are going to be going back to HD, 4K, HD cameras. At once upon a time, there was a big upcharge, and eventually they were as cheap as the SD cameras. So, what's your sense on that whole 1080p versus 4K?
Well, I think that we're big believers in that the dynamic range and the color and the contrast ratio is really the big benefits of HDR. And so you can see that. I mean, there are even some examples of post-produced content that's still done in 1080p, but HDR. And that's where I think sometimes you can get into a bit of a religious battle, as it has to be 4K versus 1080p 60. I think that content looks great. I would challenge people to be able to tell the difference sometimes. And we think it's really the right path, because it solves, probably the biggest challenge is the cost of the cameras, the cost of the production, all the infrastructure, right? So 1080p 60 allows you to do more HDR, at scale, because you've lowered the cost and complexity, right? I know Fox has begun sharing some of your panels, also concerns about the frame rate considerations, and I guess that is more sport or shot dependent, but no, we're big believers of HD or full HD, depending on who you're talking to. HDR, we think it adds a ton of benefit, and people shouldn't be, ashamed of it or what have you. What is interesting, and we spend a lot of time with our, kind of the more traditional post-produced kind of, episodic and film content. One of the challenges I think that the industry faces is much like the megapixel race that you had with cameras, right? 4K is a real simple story for consumers. And so that's where I think there does exist a challenge. It needs to be managed, but I don't think it's insurmountable. It's interesting. If you think about PCs, right? 10 years ago, we were all about how many gigahertz, how many megahertz, how many gigahertz. And Intel has somehow very successfully, kind of without anyone freaking out, in the last couple of years, the chips aren't getting any faster. Right. So they talk about cores, and now you get Geekbench or whatever different way of measuring it. But Intel has somehow successfully taken the bulk of the population from not worrying about, I have to go to 5 gigahertz from 3 gigahertz. People somehow now understand that a 3 gigahertz chip today is faster than one from yesterday, and it's better. And I think that hopefully as the as the consumers become more educated on the formats, they can have a kind of a multifaceted understanding, as opposed to right now people care about 4K because it's bigger than HD,
Right, right,
right?
exactly, exactly.
And I think as we can help consumers understand that, whether it's 1080p 60 or not doesn't matter, because and again, I think the Super Bowl was a great example of that, right? I mean, the color reproduction, that dynamic range, and quite frankly, that contrast that's created with that high dynamic range gives the eye the perception of detail and depth, as much, if not more, than sometimes resolution can.
Yeah, it was a perfect storm with gold and red as the two primary colors for the team. So it was always
Yeah,
like a really show off in HDR, that is for sure.
yeah, the
So
shiny helmets. So yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. Great. Well, thanks, Tom, for your time. We appreciate it, and we'll let people know about the webinar in a couple weeks as well. So thanks so much. Obviously, stay safe, be healthy, and the best to you and the rest of the team at Dolby.
Thanks a lot, Ken. Same to you.